Imagine standing on a runway in the Arizona desert in the summer of 1945. The war is over, the celebrations have faded, and in front of you, stretching across the baked earth as far as your eyes can reach, are thousands of the most powerful aircraft ever built. B-29 Flying Fortresses, B-24 Liberators, B-29 Superfortresses, the machines that broke Hitler's war machine, the planes that burned Tokyo to cinders, and every single one of them is waiting to be destroyed, not by enemy fire, not by mechanical failure, by order of the United States government. In the immediate post-war years, tens of thousands of aircraft were scrapped, sold off, or simply abandoned as the United States demobilized at a speed the world had never seen. Billions of dollars worth of machinery dismantled, shredded, and melted down into raw aluminum ingots. The greatest aerial armada in the history of the world, gone. With surprisingly little fanfare, and in a way that the American public barely paused to reckon with at the time, and that most people still don't fully grasp today. This is the story of what happened to the warplanes that won the Second World War, and why the men who flew them could barely stand to watch. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what was built. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States produced aircraft at a scale that had never existed before and has never been matched since. Factories that used to build automobiles and refrigerators were retooled overnight to produce wings and engines. Women who had never held a rivet gun became the backbone of an industrial army. The numbers alone are staggering. Boeing's plant in Wichita ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, turning out B-29 Superfortresses at a pace that seemed impossible. The Willow Run plant in Michigan, a facility so enormous that it stretched over a mile from one end to the other, produced a completed B-24 Liberator bomber every single hour at its peak. Ford's engineers had essentially figured out how to put an aircraft on an assembly line the same way you'd build a car. The result was a production miracle that even today defies easy comprehension. By the end of the war, the United States had manufactured over 300,000 military aircraft. Not 300, not 3,000, 300,000. That number includes fighters, transports, trainers, and reconnaissance planes. But the heaviest investment, and the heaviest cost, was in the heavy bombers. The B-17, the B-24, the B-29. These were not simple machines. A single B-17 Flying Fortress contained over 1 million individual parts. It required 10 men to fly it, and dozens more on the ground to maintain it. It burned through hundreds of gallons of high-octane aviation fuel on every mission. It was, in every meaningful sense, one of the most complex objects a human being had ever constructed. And America built almost 13,000 of them. These weren't symbols, they were tools, brutal, necessary tools of industrialized warfare, and the men who flew them understood the difference between the two better than anyone. Those aircraft had carried them into flak-filled skies over Schweinfurt and Ploiești. They had limped home on 2 engines with dead men still buckled into their seats. They had burned and shaken and somehow kept flying when physics suggested they shouldn't. For the men of the 8th Air Force and the 15th Air Force and the 20th, these planes were not equipment. They were, in some way that is hard to articulate, the reason they were still alive. And so when the order came down to scrap them, all of them, the reaction was something deeper than confusion. The moment the Japanese signed the surrender documents aboard the USS Missouri on September 2nd, 1945, the United States government faced a problem that nobody had fully prepared for. The war was over, and the country was holding the bill. The cost of demobilization was staggering. The Army and the Army Air Forces had to move 12 million men from their wartime posts back to American soil. Barracks had to be closed, supply chains dissolved, contracts cancelled. The defense industry that had consumed the nation's entire industrial capacity for 4 years now had to be dismantled and redirected, almost overnight, toward a peacetime economy. Congress was hearing from voters who wanted their sons home now. Inflation was rising. The national debt had exploded. And the political pressure to cut defense spending, to cash in the so-called peace dividend, was enormous. President Truman's administration was facing a fiscal situation that was, in plain terms, unsustainable. And in that environment, every single military asset that cost money to store, maintain, or operate became a liability rather than an asset. The aircraft were at the center of this calculation. A B-29 Superfortress cost the government approximately $639,000 to build in 1945, roughly $9 million in today's money. Storing it, maintaining it, protecting it from the elements required ongoing expense. The Army Air Forces had airfields and depots scattered across the Pacific, across Europe, and across the continental United States, all of them jammed with aircraft that now had no enemies to bomb. Every day those planes sat idle. They were costing money. Fuel had to be drained. Engines had to be preserved. Records had to be kept. And there was another problem, one that received far less attention at the time, but may have been even more consequential. The government and American industry were terrified of what surplus aircraft flooding the market might do to the economy. During the war, the aviation industry had been propped up by virtually unlimited government contracts. If tens of thousands of perfectly functional warplanes suddenly became available for purchase at pennies on the dollar, the effect on the civilian aviation market, and on the aircraft manufacturers who employed hundreds of thousands of American workers, could be catastrophic. The decision was made. The surplus had to go. Most of it had to go fast. And for the vast majority of the heavy bombers, that meant one thing: the smelter. The execution of this policy played out in places that most Americans have never heard of. In the Arizona desert, outside the small town of Kingman, the Army Air Forces established one of its largest aircraft disposal centers. At its height, the Kingman facility held over 5,000 aircraft, a fleet of warplanes parked wingtip to wingtip across miles of sun-baked desert hardpan. Men who drove past it on Route 66 have described the site as one of the most surreal things they ever saw. Bomber after bomber after bomber, stretching to the horizon, their olive-drab paint fading under the brutal desert sun. A company called Reconstruction Finance Corporation, a government-backed entity, was contracted to manage the salvage operation. Workers moved through the rows of aircraft with cutting torches, systematically disassembling them. The instruments and guns were stripped first, then the engines were pulled. Then the airframes were sectioned and fed into smelting furnaces that ran day and night, reducing the aluminum to liquid and then casting it into ingots that could be sold back to the manufacturing industry. The work was relentless. Photographers documented it. Local newspapers covered it. And yet, for all the wartime publicity that had celebrated these aircraft, the Bond drives, the factory tours, the newsreel footage of formations darkening the sky over Germany, the disposal received surprisingly little public attention. The machines that had been lionized were now simply being processed. They were raw material. They were aluminum and steel and rubber that the country needed elsewhere. And they were gone, most of them, within months. Similar scenes were playing out across the Pacific. On the island of Saipan, on Tinian, on Guam, the island chains from which B-29s had launched their long, grinding firebombing campaigns against the Japanese home islands, the process was often even more brutal. Some aircraft were simply pushed into the ocean. The logistics of shipping them home didn't pencil out. The water around some of those islands still holds the rusting remains of aircraft that never fired a shot in anger after the war ended, simply dropped into the deep because it was cheaper than figuring out what else to do with them. In the Philippines, on Luzon, there were thousands of aircraft in various states of repair. Some were stripped for parts. Others were bulldozed into mass graves and covered over. In Europe, the scale of the disposal was harder to manage, but no less complete. American airfields in England, the great bases of the 8th Air Force, places like Polebrook and Thorpe Abbotts and Kimbolton, were steadily emptied of their aircraft. The B-17S that had flown out of those fields were flown back to the United States, some of them to be stripped and scrapped, and a very small number preserved. A very small number. The men who witnessed all of this did not, for the most part, talk about it easily. There were men like one mechanic, representative of thousands, who had spent 2 years keeping B-17 flying in England. Men who had crawled through engines in the rain, patched flak holes with sheet metal, replaced hydraulic lines soaked in blood. Veterans who came home and found out that the aircraft they'd kept airborne, ships with names painted on their noses, planes that had completed 40, 50, 60 missions had been melted down in a smelter somewhere in the American Southwest. Men who said, when they talked about it at all, that it felt like something had died. Not a person, exactly, but something. Pilots described similar feelings, men who had formed the particular and almost inexplicable bond that develops between a human being and a machine under extreme stress. Combat aviation is unlike almost any other form of warfare in this regard. The aircraft is not just a vehicle. It vibrates under your hands. It responds to your inputs. It has tendencies and quirks that its crew learns over time, the way you learn the particular habits of an animal or a person. When you've cheated death together, when you've come home from Regensburg trailing smoke, when you've brought a crippled B-24 down on a beach in North Africa with 2 dead engines and a dead co-pilot, the idea that the machine deserves something more than a cutting torch becomes hard to shake. But sentiment was not a factor in the calculations being made in Washington. And in fairness to the men making those calculations, they were operating under genuine constraints. The country needed to demobilize. It needed to rebalance its economy. It needed to get back to something resembling normal life. And the cold arithmetic of the situation left very little room for sentiment. Here is the part of the story that rarely gets told. The decision to scrap the bombers wasn't entirely about economics, or demobilization pressure, or the civilian aviation market. There was a third factor at work, one that was almost never discussed publicly at the time, and that took decades to come fully into focus. The Army Air Forces, which would become the independent United States Air Force in 1947, was in the middle of an intense internal struggle over what the future of American air power would look like. The atomic bomb had changed everything. The men who would shape the post-war Air Force understood that the era of massed bomber formations, hundreds of aircraft filling the sky, each one carrying conventional bombs, was over. The future belonged to delivery systems that could carry nuclear weapons. It belonged to jets. It belonged to technology that was already in development and that would make the B-17 and the B-24 not just obsolete, but irrelevant. From that perspective, the wartime piston engine bomber fleet was not just surplus. It was, increasingly, a liability of a different kind. Some historians have argued that rapid disposal of the wartime fleet also reinforced the case for investing in newer, jet-powered and nuclear-capable aircraft. As long as thousands of B-29s sat on ramps demanding maintenance budgets and hangar space, the argument for the next generation of aircraft was harder to make. Whether that logic consciously shaped the pace of disposal, or simply aligned with decisions already driven by economics and logistics, is something the historical record does not answer cleanly. What we know is the outcome. The great bomber fleet was gone, and the Air Force that emerged from its ashes was a nuclear Air Force, built around aircraft that were designed from the beginning to carry weapons of annihilation rather than conventional ordnance. The B-36 Peacemaker, the B-47 Stratojet, eventually the B-52, which entered service in 1955 and, remarkably, improbably, is still flying today. The machines that won the war were the machines that had to disappear for the next war to be prepared for. Of the roughly 13,000 B-17 flying fortresses built during the war, only a few dozen survive today in any form, and fewer than 10 remain airworthy. Of the nearly 19,000 B-24 Liberators, the most produced American military aircraft in history, perhaps a dozen remain. A single airworthy example, a plane called Witchcraft, flies at air shows across the country, maintained by a dedicated crew of volunteers who understand that when this aircraft is gone, that chapter of history becomes purely theoretical, something that happened in books, not something you can hear and feel and smell. The rest are ingots. They are the aluminum frames of post-war American houses. They are the bodies of automobiles and the hulls of pleasure boats and the cans that held beer at celebrations of the very peace those planes helped to create. The recycling of the wartime bomber fleet fed an enormous post-war boom in aluminum manufacturing, helping to fuel the very prosperity that the greatest generation had fought to protect. There is a bitter irony in that, depending on how you look at it, or perhaps a different kind of poetry. The men who flew them are almost all gone now. The mechanics who kept them flying, the factory workers who built them, the women of Willow Run who produced a bomber every hour, the generation that understood, in their bones, what those aircraft actually were and what they actually did, they are almost entirely beyond reach. What remains are photographs, faded film footage, the memories preserved in books and archives and the oral histories recorded, often just barely in time before the last eyewitnesses left us. And the handful of surviving aircraft, maintained at enormous expense by people who believe, who insist, that some things are worth more than the aluminum they're made of. In 1945, the United States government looked at the greatest aerial fleet in human history and calculated its value in tons of recoverable metal. That calculation was not irrational. It was, in its way, entirely reasonable, given everything that was happening and everything that was at stake. But there is a cost to that kind of reasonableness that doesn't appear on any balance sheet. When you destroy the physical evidence of history, when you feed the machines that shaped the world into a smelter because it's efficient and practical and financially sensible, you are making a wager against memory. You are betting that the generation that comes after will be able to understand what happened without being able to see it, touch it, stand under it and look up. Sometimes that bet pays off, and sometimes you end up with a world where fewer people every year can quite imagine what it meant to be a young man climbing into the nose of a B-17 over occupied Europe, knowing that the sky ahead was full of things trying to kill you, and going anyway. The planes are gone, but the question they leave behind is one worth sitting with. What do we owe the things that saved us? If this story meant something to you, if you believe this kind of hidden history deserves to be told, hit that like button and subscribe. There are more stories like this one, stories that didn't make it into the textbooks, and they deserve to be heard.